We are live on LinkedIn and YouTube. Our topic today is subsidies for renewables and for fossil fuels. Participants of today, the first one is Cleveland Jones. The card is on the screen. Consultant, researcher, advisor. And Ronald Stein, engineer, senior policy advisor, co-author of the Pulitzer Prize-nominated book Clean Exploitations. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good to talk to you, Cavagna, and to have Ron with us.
Yes, sorry, I had a problem here, but it's now okay. Please let me share with you, before we start the conversation itself, the subsidies from 2023 from IEA, not so reliable institution, but okay, it's okay. Ron loves this institution, but $620 billion for fossil fuels and $168 billion for renewables. Do you trust in these numbers, Ronald Stein?
I don't trust them, but there's common sense to them, because if you're providing subsidies for fossil fuels benefits everybody on the planet. I mean, the whole 8 billion people on the planet did not exist 200 years ago, because from oil, we get all the products that didn't exist 200 years ago. And we've been able to populate the world. The subsidies for renewables, i.e. wind and solar, is only for electricity. And only the wealthy countries are doing that because 80% of this 8 billion people, they're living on less than $10 a day. They can't afford to subsidize themselves out of a paper bag. And like you say, the wealthy countries, they want to generate electricity. It's not wind and solar energy. It's only wind and solar electricity, because they make no products. The fossil fuels makes all the products.
Great. Cleveland, supposing these numbers are correct, how big difference are between them?
Look, first of all, I agree with Ron that these numbers are suspicious to begin with. But in fact, if there's many people who research this and try to say, oh, this is how much subsidies are going to this and that. The bottom line is that, three researchers, three different numbers, and they're very different, some from the others. In fact, I tend to lean on believing that the subsidies are actually much larger than that, and maybe into the trillion range, and multiple trillions. That said, obviously the world is big. The energy market, the value of energy in relation to world GDP is also big. And even in, OECD countries, energy subsidies are big, but of course, energy is also big. So I think the first comment is that numbers, no matter which numbers, are not reliable. The second is that they're all very relative. And the third item I would like to cite is that no matter how big or how small or on what type of energy the subsidies actually apply, I think there's a fundamental aspect of economic theory. Very simple. Subsidies cause distortions. That's the objective of subsidies. The governments want to cause a distortion in the way that they want things to work.
That's a good point, Ronald. Why subsidies for oil, electricity, renewables? Are them a risky business or not?
Well, Armando, think about it. If you don't subsidize fossil fuels, you have no electricity. We got 6 ways to generate electricity. You got coal, natural gas, nuclear, and
Gas,
hydro,
natural
and
gas.
wind and solar. All 6 ways to generate electricity have components: computers, wires, insulation, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all made with fossil fuels. So electricity cannot exist without fossil fuels. You eliminate fossil fuels, you eliminate electricity. And by the way, everything that needs electricity, the iPads, the iPhones, the defibrillators, whatever, is made from fossil fuels. So you get rid of fossil fuels, we're back to the 1800s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
I,
have. Sorry. Sorry. Go
no,
ahead,
no, go
please.
ahead, come on. Yeah.
No, no, no. Please, Cleveland.
Well, well, I think that is true, but we could say that everything in the world really depends, right now at least, on fossil fuels to some extent because there's some input in any product or service that depends on that. I don't know that that is the strongest argument because there are a lot of things that are also essential for supplying electricity, for supplying products to the world, and not necessarily a reason to subsidize all of them. Subsidize iron ore, subsidize aluminum ore, subsidize anything else. So I think that if we go back to trying to build an efficient economy in the world. It's not that we're globalized, but each country would try to make its economy the most efficient possible. They would actually reduce subsidies, even if the stated government goal is to, promote renewables because they're clean and so on. Even OECD or European countries, because efficiency is really achieved with other types of incentives rather than subsidies. But in fact, we're married maybe by culture, by custom, and by actual ignorance
Yeah.
from the part of government entities,
Yeah.
legislators, and so on. This applies from India to the U.S. and UK,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Uh,
Cleveland, you're 100% correct. But
Yeah,
we got to focus on conservation and
yeah,
efficiencies.
yeah,
Just because we have oil, we don't want to just burn it
exactly.
because the Earth has so many resources. We're going to run out at some time, 100
So,
years, 500 years. But this 4 billion-year-old planet is going to be here with or without us.
yeah. Yeah.
And yeah,
That's
I
right.
think we just got to focus on continued conservation and efficiencies
Efficiency.
and hopefully clone oil because we'll run out of it in
All
100 to
right.
500 years from now.
You're
yeah.
right. You're totally right. Let me put in the screen a question from Pedro Moura.
Oh, yeah.
Do governments? I cannot read very well from here because it's so small. I have
Do
several
governments
questions.
set up most of the negative externalities that renewables cause? Setting up a wind turbine burns a lot of fuel, obviously.
Ha ha ha.
Well, the first sentence, the question about renewables, what they cause. I mean, that's the book that I wrote, Clean Energy Exploitations, because it brings transparency. All the exotic minerals and metals to build wind turbines and solar panels and EV batteries, the lithium and the cobalts and the manganese, they're coming from developing countries. No
Yeah,
labor controls, no environmental controls, and we're exploiting people that have yellow, brown, and black skin so that the wealthy countries can go green. And the subsidies, the mandates, the tax breaks, the wealthy countries are encouraging China and Africa. Continue exploiting your people that have yellow, brown, and black skin. Continue the environmental degradation on your land. We're going green.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
unethical and immoral and hypocritical.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We have to get rid of some of this hypocrisy that, if we go green and let the other countries do the dirty work, the dirty
Yeah.
social impacts, environmental impacts, that kind of thing. And those also have repercussions in terms of how the world develops, in terms of democratic institutions, in terms of geopolitical crises that are set up because of poverty, exploitation, and restriction in those senses. So when we discuss, for example, China as a major source of many critical minerals, and we've discussed this before, one way of looking at it is that, oh, we have to control that by imposing subsidies. Another way of looking at it is that if that is the case, that is a given. We don't control Chinese policy. Each country is is sovereign. If that is the case, doesn't it make sense for us to use as many solar panels of theirs as possible? They're dirt cheap right now, and without any incentives on the countries that are using those panels and so on, that's an opportunity to provide electricity, renewable electricity, but without incentives. Let whoever is willing to assume the risk, the cost, and the environmental impacts and so on of overbuilding a solar panel capacity like China did, and that goes for wind as well.
Yeah. Ronald, the second part of the question, probably he is referring to natural gas, I suppose.
Well, setting up any infrastructure uses fuels, just like Ron said. There is built-in footprint of fuels. So there's no question that there's a big footprint involved in any of these projects. And in general, no country wants or does consider externalities. That the perfect name. That's why they're externalities. People are just not considering them, and that's a very unfortunate. It is true that in some particular projects, externalities are being brought up and are certain interest groups are making society aware of the impacts. For example, in pollution from burning coal, not emissions, not CO2 problems, and in fact, those externalities have been gradually internalized, even in China, which nowadays the coal plants that they build often have pollution abatement, not emission abatement, but pollution abatement.
Let me share this chart, please. It's from IMF. Look at this chart and see that the date here is 2013. No, sorry, it's 2030.
23.
So how can they predict subsidies to 2030? How can they do that?
No, you can't predict subsidies because subsidies come out of the heads of politicians and governments, and that is a tricky forecast to make.
Exactly. Ron, do you agree?
I guess the only way to predict it is government doesn't change very much. And if they did it last year, they'll probably do it next year.
Ronald, Republicans, do they like subsidies?
Well, I know they don't like subsidies on renewables.
That's a good answer.
This one was great.
I live here in California, and our Governor Newsom, he wants the whole state to be run by wind and solar. But wind and solar can't do it. They can't make any products. You can't run an airport on just electricity. You can't run the hospitals on just electricity. And he wants to get rid of oil and replace it with wind and solar.
Yeah, I think that's the distinction we have to make. Everybody has a pet peeve, and everybody has a pet project. And Republicans obviously seem to be favoring fossil fuels, so much so that even legislation in some states is ridiculously one-sided as well. We want to keep coal plants operating, this kind of stuff. It doesn't make sense to legislate above the market. The market is what we have in capitalism, and it works pretty well if you let it work. You try to meddle in it and provide incentives or controls that are artificial, distorting supply and demand of any commodity, whether it's energy or a product.
But in some countries, Cleveland, markets are second place. It's not the first.
Exactly. But even in China, for example, very controlled economy, they understand that because even though it's controlled, they forecast what an open market would do, and then they try to second guess that and do their policy interventions above that. Every country has to recognize that. Some countries are actually ignorant of that. China is not ignorant of that. They just believe that they can control things. as difficult as that is, and with very disastrous results, because right now they're exporting dirt cheap products in renewables, panels and solar and wind
Batteries.
energy, and it's not in the interest of their industry. But they can't do anything about it because they overdid it.
How do you see the convert subsidies instead of going to fossil fuels or renewables, go to science, strictly to science, research, technology, to solve the pending points in the energy sector?
You're talking about free enterprise?
Yeah.
Because, when the government gets involved in the business of picking winners and losers, that's it's not going to happen. Wind and solar would not exist without subsidies because private investment is not investing in them because they don't work most of the time and they only generate electricity, don't do anything else. So the government is, playing God, picking the winners and losers, and it's proven itself in Germany. They're the first country to go green. They now got the most expensive electricity in the world. In California, we got the most expensive electricity, most expensive fuels in the nation.
I think that I would like to say I agree wholeheartedly with the fact that governments can't pick winners and losers. I would not agree that solar is not economical nowadays, even though I might say that China may be incurring externalities in supplying very cheap solar panels. But given those prices that they export solar panels at, it
Let
is
me interrupt
economic.
you. Are you saying that solar is viable?
Solar is viable at the cost that China is supplying solar panels. In some African countries, they provide the financing. And actually, I think that's where things actually go the other way because they don't provide free financing. They provide financing with strings and with interest rates, and they don't let the countries off if they have problems repaying. But, if it's countries from Brazil on up, even developed countries, they can import solar panels at dirt cheap costs. And even with the ancillary costs and the
But
connection costs and so on,
who,
solar is still competitive
okay,
nowadays.
okay, but who are paying for these cheap costs?
These cheap industry, and
For
I would
China?
say even some projects, maybe from oil companies, maybe from energy companies, but solar projects at close to 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour, they're very competitive. Now, they don't solve the problem, Ron was right, of supplying electricity, especially across the economy. But in terms of marginal supply, yes, they are competitive. That doesn't mean that just because it's competitive, we have to expand it to 100%. That doesn't work, and it's not going to happen.
Let me clarify that. I think solar would be very good for residential use. Commercial, questionable, because with the oncoming artificial intelligence, the massive power requirements, and that power requirement is for continuous, uninterruptible electricity.
Yeah,
Whereas a home can afford electricity going on and off.
yeah.
But if you're on the operating table or your computer is running artificial intelligence, you can't have any blips. So that's why I think nuclear is gaining a lot of momentum
Yeah.
because of the continuous, uninterruptible, dispatchable electricity
But the
characteristic.
problem for nuclear that takes a long time to establish
Well, it
nuclear
may be
power.
shortening because of some of the advances in the nuclear renaissance. But
Mhm.
even here, let's be clear. Just because I agree with Ron that nuclear is the most reliable, it's actually sustainable in the sense that we have fuel for a long time. The impacts are relatively low in
But
relation to
nuclear
the other
with
energy.
or without subsidies? Nuclear with or without?
That's the problem. It is all of those advantages, but it still receives a lot of subsidies. A lot of these projects are subsidized. Now, we have to make a distinction. For example, some of the private companies that are investing in nuclear to power their data centers or artificial intelligence centers and so on, you could say that maybe they're getting away from some of the distorted supply side and into nuclear, pure place. That is iffy because we're just at the beginning of that curve.
But the point of subsidies, Ronald, every business needs subsidies.
Subsidies, tax breaks, it's incentives, but when the government, I just don't like them picking winners and losers.
Exactly. This idea that the country needs subsidies to face, no one really needs subsidies. You could argue that because you're being dumped on, either solar panels or steel or cheap soybeans, whatever, that you would have to counter with some kind of tariffs. That's a support. That's picking winners and losers. In pure economic theory, that does not work. There's a good fundamental theoretical basis for that. Even in controlled economies, even in markets that aren't really free, because we don't have really free markets, but the effects are there. You shift the supply curve or you shift the demand curve, and in either of those cases, you create distortions which cost money to consumers in an economy.
So subsidies in the beginning of the process and energy generation at the end of the process. EVs in the United States, Ronald, has a subsidy of $7,000.
1,500.
Well, let's focus on California, because in California, by 2035, they're banning the sale of gasoline vehicles.
Wow.
Now,
That's more than subsidies. That's an outright ban.
That's an outright ban. And that's going to really begin to hit the economy, because the elites have bought them. The elites will continue to buy them. But Cleveland, Armando, we're running out of elites.
Yeah.
Now we're getting down to the common folk. Who
Yeah.
very seldom
No industry survives just on the elite. Maybe the luxury goods industry. What Ron said is that controlling winners and losers to the extent that you're actually decreeing the prohibition of ICE, internal combustion engines, and so on, that is really off the charts. That has no place. I could understand in the past, for example, we identified certain industries were producing pollution which was carcinogenic, and there wasn't a way of controlling it. You could say, well, you have to stop production because that's very bad. But if that production was food, for example, you couldn't decree the end of it because people would starve. And they would. So we have to balance things. In an economy, there's good things, there's bad things. This footprint of environmental and social impacts, it pertains to everything. We just have to balance that out.
But Mr. Trump said that we'll end subsidies in the beginning of January for everything. Is it real?
Well, he's trying to put a halt on the alternative movement, because besides subsidizing the alternative movement, wind and solar, concurrently they're trying to stop all oil production.
Yeah.
And the combination of the two is disastrous. Here in California, we're today, because they keep reducing oil production in California. Today, the fourth largest economy in the world is more than 60% dependent on foreign oil imports
Exactly.
to run the state. California is a national security risk for the entire country.
A big risk.
But Cavagna, look, it's true that Mr. Trump has said many things. I don't think many analysts.
You do not believe in the most of.
I don't think analysts will hold him to his word on everything, because so far we haven't seen that really pay off. But it is true that there's very selective groups that have very selective focus on ending subsidies here and there. I think this points to the problem. It's everybody has a constituency that's interested in something, and the other side is interested in something else. We have to take the big picture, across the economy and even across the world, and say, maybe we don't have to go back to a globalized world because we're basically destroying that. But we have to be reasonable. If something is not worth subsidies here, it's not worth subsidies on the other end, and it's going to be difficult because everybody is accustomed
But
to doing that.
okay, but the decision to give subsidies from one area or another area is based on what? What's the reason?
Interest groups.
Special
That
interest
is,
groups. Yeah,
you know,
special interest groups are
yeah,
subsidizing,
yeah.
the winners and losers that they're picking. But,
That,
the article that I recently wrote was the special interest subsidies do not support the diverse 8 billion on this planet that Cleveland's referring to. Take a look at the global. Instead of subsidizing wind and solar, giving all that money to build a wind turbine, you could divert a lot of that money and help develop these 8 billion people. They don't have water filtration, sanitation systems. I think we can
yeah,
do better for the world.
There are other basic things that are not being subsidized.
but
Right.
Well,
Ryan, you and I have spoken, and I have mentioned this in the past. Because I'm here in Brazil, and I have firsthand experience knowledge. For example, with the biofuel industry in Brazil, it happens to be very competitive. Nowadays, gasoline is an alternative fuel in Brazil because less than 50% of transportation fuel is gasoline. It's
without
mostly,
subsidies.
yeah, ethanol and natural gas is on. And in Brazil, biofuels without subsidies are still very competitive. So much
Yeah, they're
so that
strong.
I believe that is a sample or a model, for example, for some Southeast Asian countries, other Latin American countries, certainly some African countries, to develop some biofuel production as diversification
Yeah,
strategy.
it's an addition of the,
Exactly.
but
It's an all
but
of the
cannot
above.
replace. Yeah, but cannot
No, you
replace fossil fuels and yeah.
exactly. That's the whole point. For example, 27% ethanol in gasoline. That's not a majority, but it is a policy that has worked well here. It's going to work well in other countries that are going to follow that example. And
I
you can
s-
only do it where it's competitive. You
and I
can't do
suppose
it in Europe. It's
I sup-
never going to be competitive.
I suppose in California, Ronald, you are using ethanol in gasoline too, no?
Oh yeah, we're basically converting to different types of fuels, and but it's all part of that, energy conservation, you know, ingenuity to get us to that point. Because yeah, we can whatever oil we have, hopefully we can make it last, twice as long, for humanity, and that's what we want to do.
Yeah,
But oil for petrochemical is not replaceable yet. This is the point
I,
you mentioned, Ronald, to
There's
have,
no alternative yet.
yeah,
No.
and a
Yes.
clone and
That's a
dying.
reality that we have to take into consideration.
Yeah,
Now, I would argue that it's not really the availability of oil because, I've mentioned that the oil availability in the world is way beyond what we'll ever use. And when the oil age is over, we'll have, trillions of barrels in the ground. So it's not that it's not going to be there. But you have to understand in what way. Certainly, alternative energies will have some part of the energy matrix, and that's very good. The mix has to be there, but we can't shift the mix artificially to one side or the other, either to retain coal, for example, when it doesn't make sense, or to push into the mix, more solar and wind than makes sense. There are
yeah.
some places in the world where you can say, and I believe so, even though I'm not a proponent,
And,
and I've said
and
that wind is destined to dry up,
you,
but
you
there are some places
do
where you can use it.
do agree with me that the subsidies that are going to fossil fuels and renewables should move to research to have a clone to oil.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jeremiah, you and I think we agree that basic science, basic research into alternative energies in terms of scientific,
No, no, no. Talking about
technical.
oil, replacement of oil. This is a big point.
No, it should not be directed like that. It should be directed into basic science. If that happens to come up, with
No,
a
I don't
new
have the
energy,
result.
whether it's fusion or whatever else, and it's
I see
competitive,
different.
then fine. It
Yeah.
cannot be directed because, oh, we have to direct
Why
basic
not?
science
Why?
to
Why
displace
not?
oil.
Why
Yeah.
not to choose a solution to replace oil? Why not? And
Because
put money
the
to research
solution
these
might be
points.
the objective cannot be to replace oil, but to make the world sustainable, whether it is
Of
from
course, of
pollution
course, of
or
course. But
other impacts.
the key problem is oil is not replaceable today. So how can
Well,
we
the challenge is we've become a very materialistic society. And oil, it makes a lot of fuels for, ships and planes and cars and et cetera. But it also makes the 6,000 products. Hospitals didn't exist 200 years ago.
Yeah.
The communications didn't exist 200 years ago. Basically, airports, yeah, they run on fuel, but there's a lot of pieces and parts
yeah.
of the airports. And if you want to keep them open, you got to come up with an alternative to oil to make those products.
But we don't want to do without those things. We want more hospitals or whatever. But I think it's not the scarcity which should be scary because at least from my research, I point out that the world has plenty of competitively priced oil and gas. The problem is if we focus on emissions as the driving reason for imposing subsidies on alternative fuels and
Mm.
mandating end of internal combustion engines, we're focusing not on a problem, but on a strategy or on a tactic. And we should
Why not?
focus on objectives that the world needs, which is health, lower environmental impacts.
Of course, of course. Looking specifically for oil, we need a solution to replace oil. The 15% of oil that goes to petrochemical and feed
Well,
this
one of the
Why should we
challenges
focus?
right now, the world is consuming 100 million barrels of oil a year. Now, most people don't relate
Today,
barrels. Now, convert it to gallons. People relate to gallons. That's 4 billion gallons of oil being extracted out of the earth every year. Now, I don't care how big the bank is, it's going to run dry at some point in time. We're not replenishing it. The same thing with, coal. There's an abundance of coal, but how many years? 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years? Lithium, cobalt. I mean, there's a lot of resources in planet Earth that we're extracting and not replenishing. And eventually, it'll be outside our lifetime, but eventually it's going to run dry.
but Ron, I think the focus should be maybe 20, 25 years because this is the time frame that we can reasonably expect new technologies to become effective enough to make either nuclear fusion or something else much more economically feasible.
Attractive,
Because
yeah.
Yes.
we don't have to focus on making sure that we have coal for 1,000 years or oil for 200 years. If we have it for 100, that's enough. Maybe in 50 years' time, if we still don't have an alternative solution, maybe we think about it. But technology is very quick in coming up with solutions. In
That's right.
fact, if you think about it, from the time of the
Good point.
first nuclear explosion to the time that we developed nuclear generation, that was very quick. The same thing can happen, even though we let that go for a long time. The same thing can happen from now over the next 20, 25 years.
Yeah, that's correct.
And I think free enterprise can do it. Government subsidies won't do it.
Exactly.
Going to
We
the
have to
conclusions.
we have to provide incentives for free enterprise, capital
Good,
generation,
yeah.
entrepreneurship. That's where the game is.
Yep.
Good, Ronald. Good. Let's go to the conclusion because Ronald has another meeting just in a few minutes. And Cleveland, in a short way, what are the conclusions about subsidies?
Oh yeah, my tack is very simple. Subsidies are bad, but they are inescapable because they are grown into the political system. So what we have to do is fight the most abusive types of subsidies on both sides: renewables, fossil fuels, and everything else.
Okay, great. Ronald, please.
Well, when I think of subsidies, I think of how are these subsidies affecting the 8 billion on the planet? You know, the wealthy countries, yeah, we can subsidize wind and solar, but the developing countries can't subsidize wind and solar. They'll never have a wind turbine. They'll never have a solar panel. And so, you know, when you take a look at the wealthy countries, you know, you take the United States, UK, Germany, Australia, you know, we represent maybe 10% max of the world. What about the other 7 billion people? And so subsidies are, you know, tunnel vision. We're focused on
That's right.
the winners
And
and losers.
conclusions. My conclusion is subsidies to my friends and risky business to all others.
Hallelujah.
That's what all politicians are practicing.
Yeah, Djalma Araújo Filho is.
Great.
Thank you, Djalma, for coming. Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you very much. Okay, Ronald Stein, Cleveland Jones, thank you so much. It was a great
Thank
pleasure,
you, guys.
this conversation.
Thanks
Great
for
conversation.
inviting us. Bye-bye.
Bye.